Thanks. First things first, Rafat is 100% incorrect about Netflix, but that's okay. What?
Did I say Netflix is going to fail?
No, you say the only one. That's not true. Just facts. But let's get going. Ash, WatchMojo is an independent company. You guys are profitable.
Correct, since 2012.
It's really hard to be an independent company today.
Very hard.
How scared are you?
Very scared, but also very optimistic because we're in control of our own destiny. But being an entrepreneur is really hard.
Well, give me sort of the case for how you are in control of your own destiny, right?
So I couldn't raise money if I wanted to, because to answer a previous question, even the VCs that wanted to sign us a check, they wanted us to kind of become a demand media model. And I was like, no. I was like, I don't necessarily think that the answer is like that the cost has to go down to zero and your output has to go to infinity. For me, low enough is good enough when it comes to cost. And your revenue model, if you chase every revenue model, you might scale your revenues, but it's not necessarily sustainable. So things that are sustainable don't scale quickly overnight. And so the VCs were like, nope, we're going to go find a demand media type of model. So by virtue of not having raised funding, and spent 6 years building a foundation of content that was evergreen, we could, over time, as we built distribution, start to build a profitable P&L where once the revenues took off, we had a high degree of operating leverage, meaning it would fall down to the EBITDA. So we were basically then able to hire people, and unlike the trend you see in a lot of big markets like New York, we were able to actually hire people full-time, give them benefits and paid vacation to give them some stability. But we were looking for storytellers that could engage with younger audiences. So by default, we would end up hiring younger people and then just train them. So we now have been profitable. We got cash in the bank. We have that optionality. If you are BuzzFeed or Vice, it's a fantastic position to be in the sense that you're generating like $600 million, let's say.
I don't know if it's a fantastic
But that's what I'm saying.
I'm
I'm trying to be diplomatic, but at the same time, there's no real path for you to make your investors happy. So every quarter, your investors are going to come and say, cut, cut, cut. In our case, that's what I mean, that like we're in control of our destiny. Tomorrow, I could sell the business because there's a lot more people that like the fact that we're profitable. A couple of years ago, I couldn't get investment. Look, I studied finance. I love M&A. It's my little pet side hobby, whatever. So investment banks wouldn't return our calls because they were running after the shiny objects, high flying, high revenue, but money losing.
Often fake.
Often fake, yeah. And so we actually had LionTree as an example was so eager to work with Mashable that they wouldn't take us on because they felt it was somewhat competitive. And I was like, okay, all good. That's changed now. Like if we did want to pursue a sale, I'm not saying we would command the highest valuations relative to other frothy periods, but we would probably get more buyers at the table. So we have that optionality. Now, I personally would like to stay independent, but I've also come to the conclusion that, in a world where there's really no barriers to entry, in a world where you're beholden to these platforms, it's probably better for my long-term health to find an organization that at least culturally and yin to the yang makes sense for us to be part of on our terms.
I want to get into sort of the broader media climate, but let's talk about just WatchMojo for a few more minutes. A quick sort of elevator spiel on like how many different ways do you guys make money? What is your distribution like these days? You said you've built a profitable, sustainable business. How has that become profitable and sustainable?
Sure.
When, again, a lot of your programming is reliant on platforms that you don't own or control.
Sure. Yeah, I think a mistake people make is when they think it's like Animal Farm. Not all platforms are the same ultimately. Mm-hmm. Like YouTube, if you go back to its parent Google, Google thinks they're the center of the universe and digital is the new universe, so they have a legitimate claim to that. But they kind of believe in a healthy ecosystem where with AdWords and AdSense it was all about send out traffic, get it back, share revenue, make more. Facebook, on the opposite, is like, let's suck in all the traffic, let's suck in all the content, and you have to pay me, Mark Zuckerberg, to get exposure. Why would I turn around? So I think already you can't treat all these platforms as the same. The way we made money early on was we used to create, again, balance. We had good quality, high quantity, good frequency, consistency. So if somebody licensed our travel, our catalog, because let's say they needed travel, they knew that the next 100 videos would look like the previous 100 videos, so that it was like brand safety before such a thing existed. The first 6 years, from 2006 to 2012, we'd get different media companies paying us a couple $1,000 each to access our catalog. We were the first content provider to supply Hulu. That was a digital brand. Now, at launch, they also had Next2 Networks and others. We were the only company that MySpace, Rupert Murdoch, signed a check. It was only $5,000 a month, but to everybody they were doing 60-40 rev share, we're like, no, what's the economic terms? And they're like, no, 60-40. I'm like, no, where's the MG? The difference was CBS's head honcho would not kill a deal over a couple $1,000. We would say, no, you can't get access to our content. So the first 6 years, we called that licensing. It was like enough money to keep the lights on. I recognized that that wasn't going to scale. When finally there was enough ad dollars that flowed into the digital landscape, particularly YouTube, then we said, okay, let's fire up the troops. Let's throw some balls down the field. So then we started to really dramatically grow our output. And we ended up being very profitable on YouTube because we didn't have expensive salespeople. We didn't have, hard, like nerve-wracking technology to pay for. So we were able to just, the 25th day of the month, I love the smell of wire transfers in the morning. We'd get a nice wire from Google. It was awesome. And we would keep reinvesting into more content, more teams, international. The challenge is there are no near-term profits that are sustainable. If near-term profits were sustainable, everybody goes after them. So we ended up at first making money from licensing, then making money from revenue share on YouTube. And then a couple years ago, 5 years ago, we hired Dave Woodley that's there. We hired Matt McDonough from The Onion, and we basically built our own direct sales. Headache. Like I used to be an ad sales guy where I was also a columnist. It's a headache, but if you want to build a multi-billion-dollar brand, you have to be engaging marketers and whatnot. So we're basically multi-revenue, but it's highly YouTube.
Highly YouTube. Yeah. How much roughly would you say of your business is advertising these days?
Well, behind there's always an advertiser. It's all ad supported. There's no Joey doesn't subscribe to we're not Netflix, right? And I do see that that's a limitation and a challenge. Whether it's directly that Universal Pictures tells us here's a couple $100,000, go create this branded content or promote Jurassic Park, or a mishmash of advertisers are running programmatic on YouTube. The invisible hand is a marketer. Mm-hmm. I am Madison Avenue's, there's no denying it. It's an ad-supported play.
And how old is the company now?
The company launched in 2005, so we're 15.
Employees?
Now we're about 50.
So the reason I asked all that was...
I'm afraid.
Just think about the insanely narrow, winding path you have just described to be a sustainable, independent media company in today's climate, and you're still looking to sell the company to a larger person. Well, it sounds like a really bad time to be in media, actually.
But here's the truth. Here's the honest to God truth. A couple years ago, it was like Studio 54 era. It was like wild, frothy, and yes, everybody wanted to buy a WatchMojo because they would see BuzzFeed, Vice, billions of valuation. So they were just tripping on each other, like LOIs without due diligence. It was just messy. Mm-hmm. But I actually felt that very naively and idealistically, I was like, in some ways, the way William Randolph Hearst was given the San Francisco paper from his dad, then his mom gave him some money, or the way Condé Nast started off with some newspapers, and then they came across the Condé Nast magazines, and then they diversified. I felt like YouTube, having this brand on YouTube, could allow us to expand and diversify into other areas, and we could become, you've heard this, stop me if you've heard this, we could be like a mini Viacom or a mini Condé Nast. As an entrepreneur, I wanted to go for that. I knew that there was a reality that in this era of forget those 500 channels on cable, it's an infinite number of channels and brands. There's no barrier to entry. There were barriers of entry for Time Magazine and for Condé and all. For YouTube and anybody here, there are none. You think you're crushing it, I guarantee you there's 3 kids in the basement about to come steal your lunch. For that reason, we are more open because we want to double down on our strengths. We don't want to have to do what the Mashables did, which is pivot and do 15 things that they're not good at. We know what we're good at, and also it's a life decision. At 41, I'm like, how much longer do I want to have fair use disputes? How much longer do I want to email Susan at YouTube telling her policies don't make sense? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So I think it's more if we could basically do this on our terms while we are profitable and while the market is more interested in profitable businesses, then it's a good time to find the right partner, right? Instead of a shotgun marriage.
Would you say it's more of a time of realism in the industry? Because what you've described in the frothy era days, right? Those were companies that built valuations off of characterizing themselves often as something more than a media company. Not that there's anything wrong to be a media company, but we're tech. We have the tech multiple, right? And look at our incredible growth because we got X many views per month, largely on Facebook and other distributed platforms, right? A lot of people bought into that. Let's just look at the numbers that were poured into a lot of these companies, both big and small. A lot of people bought into that. Do you think we've fully sort of finally hit the era where the realism or some other version of that word has set in amongst investors, potential partners, even marketers, like the whole sort of industry altogether?
That is part of it, but I think there's a bigger thing that changed. So when we launched WatchMojo in 2005, I would point to this pyramid where you had super premium content on top, whether it's Fox, ABC, Avatar, the Spielberg, like the cream of the crop. That was, we were not going to kill Hollywood, but that was the top of the pyramid. Let's skip the middle for a moment. At the bottom,
the middle's squeezed right now.
No, but
there's very little to the middle.
But let me tell you what's happened actually.
You have to be at the really small or really big, right?
but the bottom was user-generated content, which was going to radically change publishing, news gathering, but it was not something marketers wanted. So our blueprint was absolutely, while there's no economic incentive for people to put their great premium content on the internet, let's kind of reinvent the wheel and create short-form, faster-paced content for online audiences and mobile to serve that market. And we did. Our lists were very much like VH1. When we used to do travel, there was very much like the Travel Channel. What's changed in 12 years is not so much that BuzzFeed is more realistic and Vice. Of course they are. What's changed is what I alluded to in the first panel, where now that pyramid is not at all true anymore. There is absolutely an economic incentive to put your cream of the crop online. Or look at what Netflix has done. In 2015, the chairman of Disney is on TV saying, we view Netflix as a friend. Fast forward to 2017, they're like, we need to get aggressive and go direct to consumer. Right now, they're producing super premium content and just putting it straight online, hoping that it's a subscription model. So the main thing that has changed is that the traditional media companies that were going to ultimately be the buyers of the Vices and BuzzFeeds, Disney looked at buying Vice, Disney made an offer to BuzzFeed, they now have moved on. They're like, we don't need this. And it's unfair to characterize BuzzFeed as a cat listicle. They're obviously far, far more than that. It's unfair to look at Vice as just a tits and ass magazine. They're far, far more than that. But if you're Disney's corp dev department, if you're Disney shareholders, you're like, we don't need this. We have the cream of the crop, and now there's actually an economic backbone that makes this logical for us. So they've moved on, and the problem is that like the Vices of the world didn't get the memo. And because they raised so much money from investors that have these crazy liquidation preferences, these guys are stuck, hence our optionality. But obviously, the reason why I think we didn't raise the money is because we were realistic. Now, others may not have been realistic, but that's to each their own, right?
Yeah, but again, it seems like we're looking at an environment that, I mean, you just described, what, Disney. A lot of the biggest media companies, you could make a very good argument, are no longer at the very top media companies anymore, right? You have HBO being owned by a phone company. You have, the next adaptation of The Lord of the Rings coming from an online retailer, right? Like, Apple's getting into shows, has gotten into shows. You can make a very compelling, probably, argument. As much as Disney is a content company, it's more of an IP company, and they're also wanting to sell you theme park tickets and whatnot. Again, in the context of that, what's the outlook for a small independent media company? Because again, it doesn't look so rosy right now.
Okay, so I'm the one. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with one of these companies.
Well, let me ask you one more thing on that front, right? Like,
you sound like a colleague.
Like 50. You guys are sustainably profitable, but it also required not being headquartered in New York, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And as sustainable as this business is, it is still predominantly, if we're going to be fair, reliant on one revenue stream, which historically has been said not a good idea for a media company. You want to have your eggs in multiple baskets. Again, like, you're profitable, which is rare in digital media right now. Everything seems to be going well, and yet I can see a lot of risks in having the business that you have right now? So that's what I'm saying.
No,
like,
absolutely. Okay,
what's
so
the
to that
outlook for
point.
you
Okay,
guys?
so yesterday we actually, I don't know if you know this, but we mandated an investment bank earlier this year because I was tired of managing these conversations myself. Like, I studied finance, I'm a wannabe M&A guy, and it used to be nice to be in the room with these like masters of the universe to see what they were thinking. But I gave them the mandate so I could focus on the biz. So yesterday we were having conversations with a company that you all know, and they were basically like so impressed with what we do. And I told them, I said, indeed, I go, WatchMojo is not an army that is going to win World War III. But any army that is out there in this broader, whether it's a streaming war or whatever, that has WatchMojo gets a considerable advantage on the battleground. Why? Because if you think of valuations, if you look at the Gordon model, the dividend discount model, it's some, on the numerator, it's some form of revenue, but ultimately the denominator is some form of discount rate, some cost factor. So yes, we purposely by design, we're based in Montreal because it's a culturally rich city where you could hire great storytellers and who are not going to jump from
cheaper.
Mashable. It's cheap, but it's not that, it's also, I'm from Montreal.
No, sure.
Yeah. So
But
it's
it
like,
doesn't hurt.
No, it doesn't hurt, no, but I tell people, I go, you can't like, you need to, let's say when you go fish where the fish are, you need to have a sustainable cost model. Now, I think the key to that I'm getting though is, it's more that if you are the heads of the Disneys or the Time Warners, who itself in 2010 called Netflix the Albanian army, but then by the end of the decade, you sell to AT&T when Netflix's valuation is higher than yours. I think it's just that the big cheeses now realize our competition, what keeps me up at night, let alone is not BuzzFeed or Vice or WatchMojo. It's not even my old competition. I'm now worried about Google and Facebook. Today I read that Google is launching a bank in partnership with credit card companies. Would you trust them? Sure, why not? You trust them with everything else. So I think it's the fact that the FANGs, like the Facebook, the Amazons, and these companies are basically sucking everything. And because obviously the political landscape is like that, the regulators don't know what the hell they're talking about, so they're not going to be able to police it. So these guys are just sucking in so much value and so much of the landscape that I just look at it as, so long as you don't have like a Icarus-like complex to fly too close to the sun, you probably can kind of like find a safe landing for your business. But look, it's, as an entrepreneur, it's like what drives you, right? It's like when you see these tech entrepreneurs that have these aspirations to be a unicorn because somebody bought 1%, let's say, of their business at $1 gazillion, to me, well, that's not really $1 billion business, right? It's a paper concept. So for me, from the get-go, I didn't set out to build a business for the reasons that maybe some of the guys you hang out with who are kind of in New York and they kind of look at what is success. And I wanted to build an organization that I could kind of say, hey, I'm going to make decisions based on these principles and values and frameworks. And I'm going to do that until a point that I realize, okay, that's not necessarily idealistic long term. At that point, I'll hand this off to another company, and then I don't need to start another business, right? So for me, all of my rationale and framework was very different than a guy who's just eager to build a unicorn and move on to 15 others, because that's not what drives me per se, right?
All right, so, so there was talk about, going back to sort of the Deadspin question.
Yes.
Why don't these writers come together and build something of their own? Well, this was as far as I know it, this was a profitable company before the lawsuits, right? It was sustainable, it seemed. Did well enough in advertising, right? And then, of course, all the stuff that you guys talked about has happened. I mean, give me the case for anyone to launch something in this climate, because again, like, it's great to say if you're, Mr. Calacanis or whoever says, let's get all in a room together and build a new company. Again, just think of all the ways you described why it works for you guys.
Okay.
I just don't see, again, a compelling case to be like, I can start a sustainable media company.
It's very simple. You should not go into the media or content business if your number one objective, is driven by financial return, right? Like ultimately, if you're a storyteller, if you like that, if you have a passion to do that kind of stuff, then you have to think of, can I create a career and or a business that will sustain it, knowing that, like, to quote Warren Buffett and Mark Schuster, who was an investor, ironically, in Maker, You can't put 9 women in a room and have them give birth to a baby in a month, right? Content just takes time. It's not like technology that faster technology, more resources are going to make the code run faster or whatnot. So I actually don't think that it shouldn't start off with like, is there an economic model? Because the reality is it's not. Content
well,
isn't.
Again, think about all the biggest companies, right? That's also something I think that gets a little bit undercovered. For Apple, Amazon, they don't. I mean, I'm sure they would love it, but like they don't need Apple TV Plus to be profitable in the first
No, at all, because it's like Prime.
Years, right?
It's like Amazon Prime. It's a loss leader to get to another means.
Sure.
And that's actually the problem. That content will never be the highest ROI play for a company that has a bigger fish to fry, whether it's e-commerce or tech. But back to the Deadspin guys, look, the reality is the pivot to video was like a flawed execution that could have been executed smarter. And even though, like a true entrepreneur, every time they see a negative, a weakness, and a threat, they actually see an opportunity. What I was blown away by the Deadspin story was not even any of the story itself, was how much people cared about this story. You went to Media Gazer, and it was just the leading story there for 3-4 days. Now, at first, yes, I consider myself like a New York guy more than a Montreal guy because my network is here. But at first, I was like, you know what? I was like, is this just New York media navel gazing? But I go, it can't be that because these are just people that really care about it. So if I were them, I would do something like a Patreon or Kickstarter to raise a little bit, and that becomes, as the writing class, that would become their seed capital, that then they would kind of have a real seat at the table going forward instead of just the union, which I think is a nice to have, but that's ultimately more of a false sense of security. 2, I would then use the fact that they have these passionate followers and be decent Twitter followers and all that, and embrace the platforms and take their content and aggressively put it out there on the Facebooks and the Twitters to really, really get a high reach. 3, I would get somebody that understands how to I don't want to use the word pivot to video. That's been stained. We don't ever want to use that. But if you were to take these long dives journalism, but actually be able, the right person, to convert that into a story, let's use a very basic example. Let's say one of the Deadspin guys comes up with this awesome take on how like the Expos had to get shafted in '94 with the strike for the Nationals to win. That's a deep dive. You could talk about politics. You could talk about the strip clubs in Montreal, whatever that made Deadspin. There is a long-form video there that then could go make more money.
Let me flip that on you. But
you don't like that?
There's a long-form video there that could be really good. But also, there's also this notion of like, is that something that Deadspin readers ever really wanted in mass?
Okay,
no, you're talking about the pivot to video, right?
No, but that's my point. That you still
how often did people go to these sites because they wanted to watch a video? I mean, that kind of fits into what happened, right?
Respectfully, you missed my point. Yeah. That way you get 2 bites of the apple. You still give, it's like the same way that like a journalist who's worked 40 years behind a typewriter at the New York Times, that person's not going to turn around and take an iPhone and start producing videos. The Deadspin guy isn't going to be the guy that's going to produce that video, nor is the reader that has come to expect articles all of a sudden want video. But there are all these other users out there who may not be readers, who may be listeners, who may be viewers. What I think the failed video, pivot to video showed was, both as a creator of content, as a consumer, you do consume content based on type. What I realized early on in 2006 was, oh wait, those that watch video will watch a travel video and maybe like a sports video, but those who read an article will read an article that's like, let's say, business, or that's like whatever. And you got to be able to serve them based on the type of concept. If somebody's listening to podcasts, they'll probably watch a lot of podcasts. But if you don't watch podcasts, it's hard to get you started. So it's not so much. What I would do is I would basically use the core today as the people that were there on Media Gazer talking and consuming the Deadspin articles, but I would then build this business around distributed net traffic, and video and podcasts to then build a real media business. But I think for them to succeed is you gotta have a seat at the table, because there's no ownership group or outside investor that is not going to let them down, ultimately.
Fair enough. I think that's kind of almost out of time for us, right?
We're good? Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think the Athletic should buy Deadspin?
I think it needs to get profitable first, doesn't it?
I think, okay, but what are they buying? A site with no traffic now, or the writers, to hire the writers?
They're buying what they did to begin with. They went and bought, they didn't have any traffic to begin with either, but they went and bought like the best beat writer in each market that was good on Twitter.
But that's not an acquisition. It's should they hire some of them? Absolutely. I think that will happen. I think some of them are going to go to the same way Kerry went from Mashable Digiday to CNN. I think some of these guys are going to end up at the New York Times and all that. I think one or two of them are going to try something entrepreneurial, I can only guess. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lease on life. Well, here's the thing. I think what is more, my final comment, we're going to be kicked out soon. I think the real travesty is that these were websites that have been around for 12, 13, 14 years, that have been around forever, and building that from scratch in 2019 is nearly impossible. That's the thing that's a shame, because now in the era of Facebook and Google, it would be impossible to build a Deadspin and a Gawker and all that. And that, I think, is
It also does
nearly
seem to be,
impossible.
and let me know a final question, like if you agree or disagree, there seems to be pretty often a disconnect between what a sustainable media company looks like and what people who are buying or investing in media companies think they should look like.
As I said, I think you have to almost approach media and content as, well, I call it a boutique business, AKA a lifestyle business. These are not venture-backed scale, for scale's sake business. I think what is sustainable is not scalable.
Even
overnight.
Netflix has $20 billion in debt, right? So
there you
cool.
go.
We're gonna get kicked out, right?
We're gonna get kicked
Thanks.
out. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.